So last week we looked at heating systems in a greenhouse, and that's great as long as it's winter months, but in the summer months we also have to think about cooling in a greenhouse. So this week we're going to look at the second half of chapter 4B. This starts on page 27 of your book, and we're going to look at cooling your greenhouse. When we talk about cooling the greenhouse, some people will use cooling fans. Some people have what's called a pad and fan. Some people use high pressure fog cooling, and some people use shade and thermal screens, or maybe people use a combination of these. The first thing that we want to look at are cooling fans. Whenever we use cooling fans, most of the time fans, maybe 1, 2, 3, however many, are placed on one end of the greenhouse from where the air from the greenhouse is exhausted. On the other side of the greenhouse, there's a louver that opens to permit the entry of external air, and as those fans run, they pull air in through the louver and throughout the greenhouse. Usually a dual thermostat is used for this purpose, and the reason we use a dual thermostat is so that the louver will open about 3 degrees before the exhaust fans begin to open, because if the exhaust fans start to run, then it's hard for the louver, the motor on the louver, to pull that louver open. Keep in mind that whenever you're using cooling fans, you need one complete change of greenhouse air every minute for ventilation. So calculating fan size is much easier than it is to calculate heat size. The thing that you must determine with fan size is you must determine the volume of the greenhouse to determine the fan size. So if we were to take the volume of this greenhouse, volume being a three-dimensional space, we would look at the area up to the eaves being where the roof starts, and we would multiply 96 for the length times 26 for the width times 4 feet for the height, and get 9,984 cubic feet. Then for the area above the eaves, this is a triangular shape, so we're going to use the same formula and multiply it by 1/2. So we would multiply 96 for the length, 26 for the width. Since we have a total height of 11, then in this portion above the eaves, our height would be 7. When we multiply all of that times 1/2, we find out that we have 8,736 cubic feet. When you add those two together, we find out that we need a fan rated at 18,720 cubic feet per minute. This size fan would give us a total air exchange every minute, and that meets the recommendations that we mentioned before. Another common type of cooling system is the pad and fan, or fan and pad cooling system. This is the type of cooling system we have at Walters State. An exhaust fan on one end of the greenhouse pulls the outside air through a moistened pad. As the air travels through the greenhouse, the air is cooled by the evaporated water. You need to keep in mind that you don't want the distance between the pad and fan to be greater than 150 feet. When the distance gets greater than this, it's hard for the greenhouse air to be pulled that far, and you just increase the humidity inside the greenhouse. You'll see in the picture that because of the distance and not wanting to go above 150, this greenhouse has put the cooling pads on the long side of the greenhouse. Now at Walters State, our greenhouse is not 150 feet, so we've put ours on the ends. But you could put it on the long side if your greenhouse was longer than 150 feet. You must remember though that the pad is going to have to be replaced every few years unless you don't mind for algae buildup, because algae will build up on that pad. And remember that water is recirculated through the pad, so you're going to have some kind of tank to contain that water, to catch that water. That way you don't waste water. So to determine the size of the pad and fan, keep in mind or make a note that 1 square foot of pad is needed for each 150 cubic feet of air moved each minute. So if we look back to the first example where we found out that greenhouse had 18,720 cubic feet of air per minute that needed to be moved. If we divide that total by 150, we find out that we need approximately 125 square feet of cooling pad for that greenhouse. Also make a note that water flowing through the pad should not be less than 1/3 of a gallon per minute for each linear foot of pad. So, if you think about it, that's a considerable amount of water, and you're going to need a considerable sized tank to catch all of that water and recirculate. However, it is definitely attainable to get a tank that would be this size, and it's reasonable. A lot of greenhouses choose to use this type of cooling in East Tennessee. In a high-pressure fog cooling system, which is not as common as the other two that were mentioned, water is forced through small nozzles at 500 to 600 pounds per square inch. The water must be particle-free because what you're doing is you're taking that forced water, spraying it through a nozzle, and creating small water droplets. So if there were particles in the water, then they would clog those nozzles. Nozzles must be capable of delivering high-pressure water at a rate of 0.6 gallons per minute. Whenever you buy your nozzles, if you check with a greenhouse store or greenhouse supplier, they will let you know what the nozzles are capable of. You want to make sure that you have a vent open and an exhaust fan operating during fogging. If you don't, then those water droplets are going to land on your leaves, they're going to land on your bench surfaces, and you're going to increase the amount of humidity in your greenhouse. This increased humidity can increase the likelihood of diseases such as powdery mildew, and we don't want that to happen. Notice that the last point here says, if too much water is collected on the leaves, it can lead to disease. So anytime that you use high pressure fog for cooling, you need to be sure that you have those exhaust fans working to get those extra water droplets out of there. Then the last type of cooling system that we'll talk about is shade and thermal screens. Shading compounds are available, so if you wanted to paint, pretty much, it's a shading compound, but it applies like paint the outside of your greenhouse, it would provide a layer of protection from the sun's rays. Another option is to use shade cloths. Shade cloths are just pulled over top of the greenhouse. They're kind of a mesh looking material, and they provide some shade. In the wintertime, you can also use thermal blankets, and I know that we aren't really talking about heat here, but since we're talking about pulling things over a greenhouse, thermal blankets can help insulate the greenhouse during the winter. So with a thermal blanket, you would pull that thermal blanket through the greenhouse and trap an insulated layer of air above the curtain or above the thermal screen. This would reduce the amount of space that you have to heat at night. So instead of heating all the way to the roof of the greenhouse, you just heat up to wherever the thermal screen is. You also reflect the heat back into the greenhouse because a lot of the thermal screens have aluminum strips in them, and so as heat rises and it hits that thermal screen or that thermal blanket, the heat is directed back towards the ground. And because with some of these types of cooling systems we are increasing the amount of water in the air, because that's how we're removing heat, is allowing the water to absorb the heat and then pulling that water through in the air using fans, we need to remember that relative humidity is an important factor. When the air temperature in the greenhouse is warmer than surfaces within the greenhouse, condensation occurs. So in other words, if you have a bench that is cooler than the air, then condensation will happen along that bench or along the surface of the greenhouse. And this is common in the winter months when we're heating the greenhouse air, but the outside temperature is cooling the greenhouse surface. Condensation on leaves reduces transpiration because the leaves work off relative humidity. The process of transpiration works off relative humidity. So if there's condensation on the leaves, then the plants don't transpire, and that means that the plants don't pull as many nutrients through. It also encourages spore-producing diseases. I mentioned earlier powdery mildew, but any of those fungal spores that we fight with in the greenhouse are increased whenever we get condensation. Relative humidity may be lowered by exchanging the greenhouse air with cooler air outside the greenhouse. And there's a fine line there with how much air you want to bring in to keep the humidity low and how much air you want to bring in because you're looking for heat. Finally, we need to mention carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide levels are often reduced during the winter because we don't circulate as much air. So you need to be sure that you keep carbon dioxide levels high in your greenhouse because that's going to help your plants to grow. Some things you could do is run exhaust fans at a low speed to exchange the air, so maybe not a whole exchange of greenhouse ventilation like is recommended, but just slowly run those fans to keep a little bit of air moving. You can also put dry ice in a greenhouse and it will release carbon dioxide, but that's an expensive process, and unless you're going to grow cut flowers, you probably won't be able to make that money back. And then if you are burning propane gas, it releases carbon dioxide, and so that might be an option for you. With greenhouse lighting, we need to keep in mind that light is measured in foot candles. The sunlight around us is about 10,000 foot candles. If we move inside of a greenhouse, even with the most light penetrating greenhouses with glass, we lose 30 to 50% of light intensity. So we may need to use supplemental lighting, but that's not always cost effective. Again, unless you're raising a high dollar crop, you probably won't be able to afford supplemental lighting. One final word on greenhouse lighting that I'd like to add here is that the photo period is the number of hours of light a plant receives in a 24-hour period. So some plants need more light than others, and we rate those based on photo period. So plants with a long photo period need probably more than 12 hours of light. Plants with a short photo period probably will fall somewhere in the category less than 12 hours of light per day. And since I mentioned a thermostat earlier, I want to just briefly tell you the difference between a single stage and a two-stage thermostat, and we use both of these in the greenhouse, but they have different purposes. If you were using a single stage thermostat and you set it at 60 degrees, if the greenhouse temperature was, let's say, 62 degrees, as that air temperature in the greenhouse drops below 60, the thermostat contacts would close, creating a circuit causing the heat to come on. As the temperature rises back above 60, it would probably get back around 62. Then the thermostat contacts will open and cause the heating system to shut off. Most ventilation is set on a two-stage thermostat. With a two-stage thermostat, let's assume that you set it at 68 degrees. If the temperature in the greenhouse was 64, as the temperature increased to 67, right under what we had it set at 68, the first stage contact of the thermostat would close and energize the shutter intake motor. The shutter would then open. Then, as the temperature increases above the 68 to, say, 69, the second stage contacts of the thermostat would close, and that would turn on the exhaust fan, which would start the exhaust fan motor. The exhaust fan would then operate until the temperature in the greenhouse falls back down to 68 where we had it set. At that time, the second stage contacts would open and the exhaust fan would stop. Then as the temperature continued to decrease, if it did continue to decrease, then that first stage would close and then close the louvers. So as I mentioned before, whenever we're using a fan and louver, you want that fan to come, or the louver to open before the fan comes on. So to accomplish that, you would have to use a two-stage thermostat. If you are in a greenhouse, you want to make sure that you check those thermostats every couple of years. And then when we come to electricity, we look at automatic versus manual transfer. Some greenhouses choose to use automatic transfer, and we're talking about transferring electricity from a main source to a generator. The advantage to an automatic transfer system is that if your greenhouse heater, if it ran off electricity, or even if you're looking at fans for cooling, if your electricity were to go out, then you would get an automatic transfer to a generator. But these systems are expensive, so some people choose just to use a manual transfer. A manual transfer means that if the main power source goes off, you actually have to transfer the electric source over to a generator. There's nothing wrong with this system, it's just not as convenient. But when we're talking about money, it's definitely more money efficient. or at least it's more economical in the beginning. I shouldn't probably say it's more money efficient, because if you were sleeping and the heat went off and you lost all of your crops because you had a manual transfer, then it wouldn't be money efficient. But it is a cheaper system, especially during startup.